Welcome to Ocular Podcast. Today we have with us Noha Hefny. She's an incredible woman that I've recently met, and we really aligned. We connected on so many different levels, and I invited her to speak to you on Ocular, where we have different points of view on relevant topics in technology and business. Noha is a senior corporate leader, a consultant, a humanitarian, and an entrepreneur with more than 2 decades of experience in the fields of strategic communication, partnership, humanitarian protection, and sustainable development. During her career, she has represented some of the world's most powerful, admired brands, where on her journey has been directed and driven by the purpose of social impact. So with no further ado, I would like to introduce to you Noha. Hi Noha, how are you?
Hi Jeannice, how are you? And thank you for hosting me tonight.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
Happy to be here.
Oh, I'm so glad to have you. So thank you. This was kind of a on the spot opportunity. We had our time lined up, but I said, you know, this is a great conversation. Why don't we just record it? So we're taking this time to come together for our listeners to really learn more about what you're doing, how you have this purpose-driven social impact lifestyle, and just to learn more about you, and let's have a conversation.
Thank you, Jeannice. I mean, for me, purpose started at a very young age. So just to give the audience a little bit of background, I was born in New Zealand to a family of diplomats, and I found myself really living in multiple countries around the world. So from New Zealand, I ended up in Switzerland. From there, I moved to Ethiopia. And this is where it all started. So, you know, I used to be living in a very nice house, I would say, but right across my gate, the gate of the house, was, you know, these mud houses that were made of metal sheets with very, people living in very precarious conditions with no light, no ability to cook. The children were almost definitely, you know, had no shoes. They didn't even go to school, I believe. Or if they were, you know, trying to learn something, they had no electricity. I mean, every single one of the biggest challenges that the world is facing today when it comes to, you know, poverty and economic disadvantage or challenges. So at that age, all I could do or think to myself is, you know, there's something that's not right. And this is what we call today inequality. But at that time, I was like, how is it that as a 13-year-old or 12-year-old, or even maybe younger, you know, how is it that I live this life and that right outside my door, there are kids my age who live a completely different life? And I tried to make sense of it, and I started by volunteering. So I used to do a lot of volunteering work in Ethiopia with many NGOs. One of the most memorable, one of those volunteering experiences were actually, I used to horseback ride. So I actually did a charitable horse ride for 21 kilometers with a bunch of friends and raised a lot of funds for a charitable cause to help many of those people that were living, you know, in our surrounding communities. So that's how it all started. But then after Ethiopia, I ended up back in Egypt, in my own country, where again, you know, I continued to witness inequalities, whether, you know, from a poverty standpoint or even social inequalities. And I always wanted to do something about it. And so when I got to college, I was like, okay, I have to study political science, international relations. And, you know, it was absolutely, it was like absolute conviction. I mean, you know, I came out of school, you know, after having done so many Model United Nations programs, and I was the Secretary General of my school's MUN. I mean, I was a student leader even in high school. And I always looked at the world or myself within that world as a global citizen. So when I went to college, I was very convinced with my major, political science. And I ended up continuing in Model UN and all of these things. And when I graduated, I was like, okay, what do I do now? I really, have all the power and the drive within me to actually make a difference. And I went and I started working as a volunteer for the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. And, in the beginning, I was really interviewing asylum seekers who were arriving in Egypt, seeking refugee status. And I have to say that this was a life-changing experience in every sense of the word, starting with the diversity of the people and the nationalities that I met, which was really a continuation of my global journey across different countries. But, this time, these people were all, fleeing persecution on different grounds, and I had to interview them. I had a great responsibility to make decisions on whether these people, are accepted as refugees or not. And this is how I started my career, counseling women who were survivors of violence, unaccompanied minors arriving to the country as well, with no family, and trying to reunite them with their family somewhere in the world, and conducting all these interviews at ports of entry. And then a year later, so I was eventually hired. So from a volunteer, I became a UN staff eventually. And I ended up a year later on the field in East Sudan in a refugee camp in a place, in a small town called Gadaref. And again, I was the only Arab woman on the field. But at the end of the day, I had to collaborate with, my Sudanese government counterparts who were very kind to me, but I also had to witness, firsthand how people were living in these refugee camps and the types, the type of assistance that they need in order to have their rights preserved and, have a decent, dignified life. So it was a really moving experience. Returned to Egypt as a totally different person. I was in my 20s at the time. And I have to say that, I changed. So when my girlfriends would come and tell me their, boyfriend stories, I was like, guys, you guys don't have any problems, So I became a bit desensitized about, I guess, day-to-day problems because of my experience. However, I have to say that the same skill that I used to sort of feel is different about me versus my friends after being on the field is also a skill that really helped me when I moved to the corporate world a few years later, because I was also a very cool head in times of crisis. And I used to work in communications. And so 60% of my time, I used to handle crisis communications. So
putting
the media
out the fires.
And putting out the fires. And that same skill of not being, being a little bit desensitized to the day-to-day helped me really navigate and persevere and be resilient in these times. That's it. And I continued with UNHCR, went to south of Algeria at some point, but that time I was working on a family reunification program, which was, again, this was probably one of the most emotionally moving projects or humanitarian operations I've ever worked on, because we were reuniting families that have been separated from each other for more than sometimes 35 years of 35 years. So, a brother who hasn't seen his brother, a mother who hasn't seen her child. And we used to take them from the camps in south of Algeria, move them to the other side of the border in south of Morocco, where they would spend a week with their family and then return them back to the camps. And, that kind of operation, just showed me that, we are so blessed in our life to have our family with us, our kids with us, and not to be impacted by conflict or the need to be forcibly separated. And it changed, again, my perspective. And on a personal level, all of these experiences, I guess, gave me resilience very early on in my life, in my 20s. So I finished my experience with UNHCR. and I moved to PepsiCo, where I started in 2008 working as an internal comms manager. And I ended up, growing in the organization from that role all the way to basically heading the corporate affairs and social responsibility department for the Middle East and Africa region. And there again, I saw a totally different perspective of leading with purpose or implementing purpose, or integrating that into a business model. And, obviously on multiple levels, whether it was, how a business can fully integrate sustainability or social responsibility into its business model, or through the implementation of multiple partnerships and programs to help women, youth, to develop talent in the region that I was leading. I mean, again, a very different angle to socially responsible work, but very, very enriching. And until today, most of what I learned, in that experience, I've been applying into my life. And I took that on with me after the corporate world. After PepsiCo, I went to McKinsey. And after that, I went to UN Women. Again, I returned to the UN, this time to work on gender equality and leading partnerships and communications at UN Women. And during this, period, it was all about, starting introductions about UN Women, the role of UN Women, why gender equality is important, why, the world loses a lot economically and politically and socially when half of the world's population is not empowered, right? And how we need to all step up in order to make, advancements and to realize progress on that front. And there again is when I decided that, I need to start, and ignite, something of my own that can really advance the status of women and their roles, increase the percentage of women in leadership and also the visibility of women. Because one of the biggest impediments to reaching senior leadership positions is exposure, is visibility. And a lot of us, we kind of shy away from that. So we wanted to do something about it. So myself and a friend of mine got together and we created She's Arab, which was the first and is the first dedicated speakers platform for Arab women in the world. And what we do is we've created a speakers bureau that highlights the role models of Arab women from different sectors, whether they are, thinkers, artists, engineers, business leaders, and we've put them all on a platform and trying to match them with speaking opportunities internationally so that we can, first of all, change the perception about Arab women, because there's been a lot of negative stereotypes about how we are and who we are and how we live and if we can ever be leaders. So yes. We wanted to address that. And so we created this platform. And along with that, we offer professional development, advisory services to organizations on gender equality. And we're running a network. And at the moment, actually, I'm transitioning from She's Arab, but my dear friend and business partner, Samar Shurafa, is taking the lead and pioneering ahead with this business. So that's She's Arab. So this is, I know I've been talking a lot, so please feel free to cut me off in the upcoming questions.
It all sounds so good. It's hard to, it's hard to cut in there. I do have, if I could digress you back to the time of, there's several points I want to try to hit. One is digressing you back to your university time. Yes. Where you really identified, and before then you actually identified the needs of others, but then began to take on this role of saying, well, I know that I have to in some way make this formal. So you decided to study political economics, or political science rather. And that political economics actually was my field, so it was very much aligned with what you studied. But looking at political science so you could understand the true context and the theory behind some of what you were seeing. So I completely understand. Did you find in college, so say for instance, we have some of our listeners that are actually in college or graduating from college. Is there any advice that you could give them in regard to that, the theory? Because as we know in the university, it's a lot of theory, whether you're in engineering or you're in business or you're in some of the humanities. We have to study the theory, you know, the old gray-haired guys that really didn't have a sense of reality. Or they were, they were scholars, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they really focused on the utopian concept of what the world could be and what it wasn't. So could you advise some of the students as far as, there's some people that may just be learners, curious, they're leaders in their own right, as to understanding that the theory versus the reality
Mm-hmm.
of what you experience?
Absolutely. I mean, okay, first of all, I mean, international relations or political science is fascinating because I think the best part about it is really that it broadens your mind and it allows you to understand different political systems, different countries, different disciplines. I mean, I studied a little bit of everything, like human rights, international law, China, the US, the political systems in different countries. And I think this is fascinating in the sense that it broadens your mind. But when you go out to the real world, it's a different world, right? So all these theories are great, as you said, but for instance, you know, you come to realize that, you know, let's take, for instance, the UN system where I worked for quite a while. I mean, at the end of the day, you know, you have a lot of great people, very passionate, in love with humanity, wanting to serve. But the reality is funding makes a difference. You know, is there a budget to do things or not? The bureaucracy of the system also may slow, you know, how quickly humanitarian workers or others would like to actually achieve the progress or the change. Countries' interests dictate also these things. So putting all of that into consideration, what it boils down to is really, I believe, your intention and your impact as an individual. So every single person I met as an asylum seeker or refugee in my career with UNHCR, or every single partner I tried to bring on board for UN Women, or every single partner I even tried to start a partnership with for PepsiCo and CSR. You know, all of these interactions, the more you put your intention and your heart into it, this is where the real impact is. So we can sit and read a lot of books and we can gain as much knowledge as we want, and we can travel the world and meet so many people, and it's enriching. We need the knowledge. I mean, I'm not suggesting that it's not valid, but at the end of the day, what truly makes a difference in this particular field is you as an individual and how much you believe in the work that you do and how much you also want to go in order to change things when they're not working. Because no matter where we are, whether it is, you know, I've worked again in the corporate sector, in entrepreneurship, and in the UN, 3 different systems that have different values altogether or ways of work. Again, it's really about our drive. It's really about our belief that we can make a difference. And that belief I've had since I was a kid. Since I was 12 years old, I knew that I could change the world, and I didn't care if I would do that alone or with a lot of people. And what I realized is that the minute that I believed that I could make a difference, I found a lot of people, like-minded people who shared that vision and came on board to actually make that intention, that dream, that even if it was a small change, actually happen and real. And you also need leadership. So, you know, there is, you know, when you work with very complex problems, and I believe all the sustainable development issues are complex, are big, they have a magnitude that no entity, whether it is a government or a company or an individual, can solve on their own. I mean, you need a mass to address these issues. Again, so you need leadership, and you need bold leadership. You need people who are aspirational, who actually look at these numbers like, okay, we have, let's say, you know, 1.2 billion people with no access to electricity. What are we going to do about that? You know, that number is like, where do you start even? Which country do you go to first? Where do you put the budget if you're going to allocate it? And it's a small budget usually. It's never enough for everyone. So you need aspirational leaders who believe that they can challenge themselves for bigger numbers. And I saw that very loud and clear in the private sector when we worked on sustainability in PepsiCo. You know, some of the goals and targets on the sustainability agenda were quite aspirational.
Yes.
And in fact, I believe that because they were, and the leadership had a full commitment to that and belief that they can actually achieve this, although it's a very big number to achieve on, for example, reducing our water use, or, for example, educating girls around the world. I mean, you know, you had huge targets. So the fact that they believed in it made the employees and the rest of the organization also have a greater purpose and a greater meaning that they also aspired to achieve. And by doing that, you create this ripple effect that everybody wants to work towards, and change actually happens. And the results can be astonishing because, you know, you even sometimes exceed the targets that you've initially, you know, set for yourself. So
yes, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, no. But I'm excited by what you're saying, because I get the sense that there is that connection or the alignment of values that comes into play. And when values are aligned, whether it be in a corporate setting or in an NGO setting, or as an independent that's working as a volunteer out in the fields, if you will, doing good work, doing humanitarian work, it gives you the opportunity of truly saying, I'm latching on to that vision of making it better. Because you mentioned the SDGs and of course several times the UN, and the UN, as we know, are founded in the past few decades and focusing on these SDGs, these standards for life that they have actually identified as being nomenclature, or something that should be a standard or a norm, if you will, for everyone around the world to live by. So when thinking about that, I mentioned just in passing with you, it being a framework, it being an actual vision, something that's aspired to. So in thinking about these bold aspirational leaders that you mentioned, what would be some of their characteristics? I mean, we could go in lots of different directions with that, but tell me about their characteristics, their values that you see in being able to forge this kind of framework forward.
A number of things. I mean, definitely passion and determination and belief and conviction in this, you know, particular field, and that it's important. But I talk about how they made it, from the successful leaders I saw, how they made it happen. Yes. One is a clear commitment and tone of voice at the top that tells the organization that, for example, something like sustainability or diversity and inclusion, which are seen as, you know, as nice to-dos for some companies, but the leaders who truly succeed make them an integral part of their business strategy. They communicate about these issues consistently in every single opportunity that they have with their employees. Now, the other thing is, when it comes to sustainability particularly, or CSR, I think, you know, the relevance of the causes that we choose to support is very important. Are these causes relevant to the business? Are they intertwined? Do they go hand in hand? The scale, you know, in terms of how, we're not doing CSR on the side of the business. We're doing this as an integral part of our strategy. The balance between short and long term, you know, how do we balance our investments in these initiatives? And all of these are indications that, you know, the leadership would take these things seriously. It shows that they are committed. It shows that they are really serious about translating words into action. So, you know, and what I mean by that is, you know, you need to have not just words, not just the tone at the top. That's the starting point, is the commitment and the tone. But what comes with that is a strategy. What comes after that is an action plan that's fully integrated across every single function in the business, so that it becomes, you know, so that sustainability or CSR or D&I, diversity and inclusion, becomes, you know, the DNA of the company. It's integrated, it's in every function. And I can give you a very simple example, like when we talk about environmental sustainability, for example. You know, I used to work for a company that, for instance, one day thought about investing in a telepresence, a video conferencing facility for the office in order, you know, to reduce travel and all of that, like just leveraging technology in a much more effective way. And however, when making that decision, and this is where the mindset is different when a company is very serious about sustainability, and making that decision on the table, on the decision-making table, the question came up of how much of our carbon footprint are we going to reduce by introducing that technology and by investing in it. And so the decision doesn't only become around, you know, work-life balance or, you know, automating the business in a certain way or another, but it also integrates the element of sustainability. It also shows that when we invest in that, you know, and put that money, you know, at the forefront of introducing such a new technology, you know, it's also going to have a very positive environmental impact, but also a talent sustainability impact. So here you see the DNA of the company, you know, shaping up to really ask those questions in every single decision. And I'm talking, this is you know, an IT decision. It's really purely IT. It's purely tech. You could say, like, who cares about carbon footprint? But at the end of the day, if it's fully integrated, the question is asked at every single, you know, meeting, at every single touch point. It becomes second nature, if you like. It's part of the values. And I think this is an indicator of success, specifically on the point of, you know, did we succeed to build a culture that embodies, you know, and integrates sustainability or CSR or diversity, for instance. So I think
stone, right? It gives you a touch point in which to refer to in a corporate setting, especially. And you can say, well, did we actually make that mark? Is that what I hear you saying? It gives you, if you're mentioning it in every board meeting or every department meeting or something of this nature, maybe not everyone, but, you know, often, and it's part of the regular conversation, then you actually have a milestone, you have a benchmark, and you can assess based upon that. Very good.
But it starts with the leaders always. So, you know, again, nothing can really, you know, and when I say leader, just to clarify as well, it can be anyone in the organization. Yes, at the end, you need the executive sponsorship and everything, but anyone, whether, you know, no matter what is the level of that person in the organization, can trigger that discussion about sustainability, about diversity, about all of those issues that we want to advocate for and that we believe in. And once you...
I'm sorry. I didn't know if and hopefully people within the organization, I was just thinking about those leaders that you were thinking about, they would actually exercise their muscle because they would find something that would connect their heart to mind, and they would jump in and begin to talk more about it. And you mentioned retention. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. This was a good conversation.
No, it's very interesting. I mean, yes, absolutely. I mean, you know, at the end of the day, to succeed in driving all of these agendas in business, it's very important to build a business case. And it's very important to recognize that sustainability or corporate social responsibility has to be profitable, it has to be relevant to the business, and it has to be fully integrated. The other thing we need to look at is, you know, I mean, why businesses do that is very important. So I'll leave Jeannice to ask me that question because
No, I think the conversation is phenomenal. Just continue, because in thinking about why companies do it, especially with a lot of the uprising and conversation that's going on in this particular season that we're in, we don't want rubber stamps. You know, there's a lot of Twitter going on and people sending through social media, various companies that are actually supporting points of view that would be contrary to humanitarian actions and not really looking out for the global good of people. So that is a real conversation. There's no longer that tolerance for the rubber stamp. There's no longer the tolerance that people can actually purchase a product that is not supporting a humanitarian cause or leading to good for all. And this is very, very important. I think the SDGs that were so honorably presented by the UN is something that I've supported in IT, I've supported across the board, because they are an incredible framework that people could actually, they're broad enough that people can understand them and yet be able to drill down in action. And that's what we want. We want that action. So share with us about the business, since you asked. Go for it and give us some insights in regard to that.
No, I think I just wanted to highlight why this is so important for so many businesses. And I really, as an entrepreneur, Yani, I really hope to see more of the small and medium enterprises also, starting to think of how to integrate sustainability and the SDGs into their business model. But anyways, going back to the larger corporations or organizations, I think there's a couple of very interesting things happening in the world. One of which is, decreasing trust. Okay, so in many of the, global surveys by Edelman and others, it has been established that amongst the new generations, like the, millennials and Gen Z, etc., that there is reduced trust in businesses. They are amongst the least trusted stakeholders. And therefore, again, how do you want to attract this base of talent, right, to work for you if you're not going to act responsibly? And I think this is very important. Another thing is, obviously, in recent years, we've seen the whole movement around climate change and environmental sustainability. And also with the rise in digitization, technology, you're seeing greater transparency. I mean, companies can no longer, go unknown around certain violations on the environment, or how they manufacture, or how they source their raw material, etc. So with all this change, with the digitization, with greater transparency, with more public, scrutiny around different things that is facilitated also by social media, etc., it's very important to have your record straight on sustainability, if I have to say it bluntly. And so I think more and more, we'll see more and more of that, with the continued digital transformation that is happening, and the greater transparency that the world is witnessing in general. The other thing is that, we are continuing to see across the world a lot of social inequalities, whether it is in terms of wages, whether it is inequalities between countries, developed and developing, and so on. So at the end of the day, companies now, are actually navigating what you call a VUCA environment. And so, we're looking at a volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous world where, it's no longer easy to forecast the future and, plan 10, 15 years ahead. You'd be lucky if you can forecast the next 2 years, right? So at the end of the day, in such a complex, ever-changing world, it's very important as well to look at sustainability, to look at responsible business practices as a license to operate, Another aspect as well that I'll end with, it's really my last point on this part, which is, about the interconnectedness of all the stakeholders that a given business, whether small, medium, or large, is dealing with. So, from your employees to your customers, to your investors, to the communities that are surrounding, for example, manufacturing facilities or your business. I mean, again, all of them are interconnected, and this has been, again, facilitated by technology, by digitization. And so with this interconnection, it is very important to make sure that businesses, keep a positive reputation and a positive standing on their practices socially and environmentally amongst all these stakeholders, because in one part, you know, if you're not doing well with the community, that will impact the regulators and the government. If you're not doing well with the government, that will impact your investors, and so on. And, you know, the loop goes on, and then eventually no one will want to actually be employed by that company, so it will impact your future talent base, etc. So what I'm trying to say here is sustainability is not a nice to do. It is not something you do on the side of business. It is a must do, and it is a license to operate. And I don't believe that any company that is not going to integrate sustainability effectively and sincerely and transparently into its business model is going to survive in the future. And I know that this may be a very bold statement to state, and I know that many companies have already done a lot and have embarked on that journey, but I think my message is to those who haven't started that journey. And my message is also to the entrepreneurs, you know, who are starting companies, to actually take the opportunity to integrate that kind of mindset and culture and strategies into their business model from the very start, because there's only good that can come out of it. And there's only profitability that can come from purpose. Because as we're seeing now with all the awakening that we're going through in COVID-19 as well, people are becoming more and more conscious. And this, you know, public scrutiny, regulatory scrutiny, etc., will continue to increase the more and more the world also gets connected. So I urge all my fellow entrepreneurs to actually think of the SDGs, think of sustainability, think of being socially responsible from the very start of your journey.
I completely concur. I completely agree. I've been in conversations and I advise many entrepreneurs on their business development, and my conversation has begun to evolve in the past year. They've begun to, initially I was speaking to a group at the university. I was teaching at Santa Clara University in the School of Engineering, and happened to be in a conversation on loan, if you will, in the business school. And the conversation was with entrepreneurs from all over the country that had come to this conference. And I was sitting at the table and happened to say, well, you know, what are you doing in regard to developing some of your SDGs and your DIEs, looking at diversity and inclusion, a sense of belonging and equity and what have you? And most of them, actually, all of them said it was not on their radar. It was something that they weren't really looking at, they weren't interested in, they definitely weren't investing in. They were more interested in their bottom line. And that really was disheartening to me. Number one, that they were so comfortable with saying it. But number two, that they hadn't really looked at the triple bottom line. They hadn't looked at the blue ocean, as you had mentioned, the environmental side of things. And many of them were having impact. They hadn't looked at diversification of their talent pool in the initial stages of hiring. And many of them had over 50 to 100 to 200, they were SMEs, employees. So they had already started their hiring practices and were well on their way past the seed round, past the C investments of investment levels, if you will. So they were in the profit stages. So I'm thinking, as a profit organization, and you hadn't really started from the beginning, what's going to happen down the pike later? How are you actually building your product, number one, to meet the needs of your customer? I just went back to basics. How are you actually building your product for these people that you haven't included into your workforce and not considered them at all? So I agree with you. It's something that we individuals that are working on the front lines with these entrepreneurs in the advisory capacity, or as consultants, whatever we may be, investors, I know for fact it's something that should be mandated. Mm-hmm. And it's not just for these women-owned companies, which over 60% of them now are women, are startups. But it's not just for those. I think women are becoming more cognizant. Of course, they're bringing their sister friends along with them. They're bringing women that either have certain skill sets that have not fit well into the corporate structure or have not gone down certain roads to really, they found a different lane and just basically said, well, I'm going to develop my own, which I have said to many people, just develop your own company. Why not? Go for it. So if they hadn't thought about that and they're not these women-owned companies, then the other 40% that are not started by women, I'm speaking of startups, right? Entrepreneurs, then their possibility of actually being sustainable is lessened. Their possibility of, and when we speak, I believe you could elaborate on this, but when you speak about sustainability, we're looking at the fortitude of success. We're looking at building that infrastructure in which they could actually be successful. It's not sustainability from an environmental standpoint or a political standpoint. It's all the pillars, looking at the society, looking at the environment, as well as the political structure of building this well-supported, well-grounded organization. So in looking at that, how could we, what do you think could be our next tactic? What do you see? They've got the SDGs. We've talked about that. People know that they're out there. What could be our true call to action as a consultant, as an advisor, as an investor, to really get them on board to say, well, my thought is, if you don't have this in place, then maybe you should not get that round of funding that I'm looking for. You know, I mean, is there some kind of, what do you think?
I think the starting point that is a minimum standard is really, you know, looking at ethics and compliance, right? Or the governance of the company. So, you know, really ensuring there that from an ethics standpoint, you know, what are our values? What do these values, you know, stand for? I mean, what do we stand for? It's very important. And I think a lot of, you know, having been in the startup field, I think a lot of companies don't spend a lot of time in the beginning looking at, you know, these things, the values, the vision, the mission. Is it socially responsible or not? And this is the first question to ask. Do we have a purpose? What's our reason of being? And I think, you know, it may sound, you know, very, I don't know how to put that, but, you know, it may sound very general, but it's not, because this is the foundation for everything else that will come later. The other thing I would say is, you know, ensuring that we have the right governance. So how do we go about violations in the business of any sort, you know, fraud, corruption, you know, I don't know what can happen, but, you know, again, if we have that good foundation, it will eventually lead to a better system that can enable sustainability, that can enable diversity and inclusion. So it starts with ethics and governance. This is what I would say. Within that, I think also the one thing that as a startup, I would say is absolutely a must, and particularly for the medium-sized companies, is labor practices. I mean, if we're not going to do anything from the whole SDG agenda, you know, and we do have employees, I think the first and, you know, minimum standard would be, how do we treat these employees? What culture are we creating for them? Are we subconsciously or unconsciously creating biases in recruitment and, you know, in integration within our organization? Are we promoting people the right way? Are we compensating people the right way? Are we overworking people? You know, all of these have to do with ethics. And without going into a big strategic framework and integrating the SDGs, you know, this is really the bottom line. You know, women who come to work for us, if we are, you know, which whatever, even if we're a women-led business, you know, are we, again, giving them the right opportunities? You know, and really looking at our own biases in everything that we do, you know, whether it is, you know, on the hiring with the, you know, our labor force, or getting women into the business, but also, you know, in every judgment call that we make, are we being fair? Are we being transparent? And it goes back again to ethics and governance. That's what I would say on that. This is the main.
I really think that we need to speak from the rafters on this. I think that it's critical to think about the SDGs as the framework for establishing organizations, for putting together the characteristics of the labor force that you want to hire. And I'm speaking about the entrepreneur, of course, but also let's look really at the accountability for organizations. And you mentioned the actual leaders having these values in place. How can a company or how can individuals actually support those companies that they truly do identify leaders that are not so much rubber stamping and saying, yes, we're following one guideline or two guidelines and we like women and we just announced the hiring of a woman and she happens to be the VP of D&I. I mean, if I see another broadcast of another woman becoming VP of D&I, I'm saying, well, what about IT? What about your finance department? Show me some promotion in some of those areas that I know that women are qualified to be in. So how do we actually support those companies that actually may be looking at women in those roles? And because we want those companies to actually forge forward, right? And to be those role models for the other companies and to be that, look at the competitive advantage, as Michael Porter would say, of these companies that have really taken off and their bottom lines have improved because of their SDGs. So what do you think? I'm asking kind of a convoluted question, but how do you see supporting those types of industries, i.e. companies that are doing that?
Supporting the SMEs who are doing that already?
Absolutely, the SMEs or corporations that are really forging forward with that.
I think we, in some countries,
you know, there has been incentives, for example, from the government, where, you know, on hiring, you know, women or placing women in senior leadership roles. So that's, you know, clear advancement on, you know, SDG 5, for example, or clear advancement on diversity and inclusion agenda when it comes to women. You know, I think so. One is definitely incentives, awards from governments for companies who are doing that. The second is, you know, in some countries there are, you know, waiving of taxes, for instance, for companies who actually undertake humanitarian or social responsibility activities. It's not widespread, but, you know, these sorts of incentives, whether awards that recognize these companies and place them ahead of their you know, other players in the industry, or, you know, sort of financial levies on certain aspects of the business would be, you know, very effective ways to encourage people to, companies to actually continue investing in these journeys. However, to be honest, again, you know, you were talking about how certain women are being hired as D&I leader, and, you know, yes, we're talking now about how do we incentivize the companies to do what's right. And I think the conversation as a whole should be changing in general, in the sense that, you know, it shouldn't be that we're hiring a woman, for example, of color or other, to take on a new role because, you know, we're trying to drive gender equality or, you know, an increased representation of women. Yes, it's important, and this could be a target or a goal. But what we should be looking at is really on the women piece, the diversity and inclusion, and treating men and women equally first, putting the right policies in place to ensure that there is no bias, there is no discrimination, getting the women to the top, you know, equally based on merit, without discrimination against the men as well. And what I'm trying to say is, like, the more, you know, we emphasize, you know, these roles and we put them in the newspaper, the more we are actually putting women in a weaker spot, because at the end of the day, you know, we shouldn't be distinguishing them in terms of their leadership, and it should all be based on merit. I think the recognition could be in another form, not in terms of an appointment, but in terms of recognizing the actual achievement, the actual qualifications, you know, doing something a bit deeper than a press release, announcing a bio and a person. On the companies and the incentives, this is, for me, the way I see it, it is reality. At the end of the day, government relations are important for many companies. The incentives that come from that are very important. The recognition that comes from that are very important. However, at the end of the day, I also don't believe that this is the reason why a company should do what is right and should be fully, active on implementing its sustainability agenda, or integrating, a sustainability agenda into the business to start with. I think that they should be doing this anyway. And as I mentioned, it is a license to operate. It is a way to be, a good corporate citizen. It's as simple as that. And as I said, in the future, I don't think that those who don't do it will actually be profitable. I think that, the integration of profit and purpose is no longer, a question. It's no longer a nice to do. It's no longer optional. It's a must do for every company in order to be profitable and to be credible, and for them to continue having a good reputation in their community, with their investors, and with all their stakeholders.
Very good. Now, this is a fantastic, I could stop there, but I do have one other point. I have many points, but one other that I'd like to bring to mind is that in thinking about this, we both have agreed that bringing women in at certain levels just because it's good press or it's something good, that really follows suit to say bringing in the diversity across the board is very, very important, from the boardroom to the C-suite to senior managers, management level, and also promoting within the organization is very critical. So I wanted to just emphasize or get your feedback as well, but to place emphasis on when people are brought into the organization, it's not so much that they are brought in, but they belong. And there's that buy-in at every level, that the individuals that are hired, whether they be of color or whether they be of gender and gender of color, or gender, color, disability, something of that nature, a protected employee, if you will, is very important that they are felt welcome, and that the sense of that they come in as qualified individuals is known throughout the organization. And what I find quite often, I mean, put some of your knowledge to this, please, Noha, is that when they're brought in, quite often they don't have a sense of belonging. So you may have a press release of someone that comes in, is this beautiful woman. I mean, beautiful in the context of she's skilled, she's talented, she has a track record. She may even have a track record. And she comes in at this high level C-suite, and they're touting her, they're putting out the press release, and then within a year, maybe two, she leaves. Mm-hmm. So that flight happens. So then you begin to wonder, what's wrong with her? She had this very nice position. She's able to move the needle, especially here in Silicon Valley. If they bring her in, it's usually in tech or tech-related field. And why did she leave? There must be something wrong with her. Absolutely. So can you, speak to that? Because that really happens quite often, that women of color, people with disabilities, women, are brought in, and then they're not made to feel welcomed. Mm-hmm. So could you speak to that?
Yeah, I think what's on paper is not always the reality that happens inside, the companies. And I think the companies have, most companies who are actually very committed to these, the agenda of diversity and inclusion, I think they have the best intention to actually be inclusive. But the reality is, two things there in the example that you give. One is, how well are we preparing, our leaders to assume leadership? especially in the transition from manager to leader. This is one aspect. But then also for those coming from outside of an organization, people who don't know the culture of our organization, how well do we, onboard, assimilate, integrate? This is very important. The second part is about culture, and unconscious bias, for example. And this is the hardest, I think it's the hardest part to address, because it's simply, it has so many different layers. All of us, we come with our different backgrounds, and we all think that, we never think that we're being biased, but, subconsciously we could be. And again, that tends to exclude, different people. The other last point that I would want to say is that in certain organizations, there tends to be sort of a mold of a definition of who a leader is, or how they should be like. However, the reality is, when that is the case, are we really, embracing people of different thought, culture, backgrounds, etc.? The answer is no. I've seen it time and again that people who come who are a little bit different, a little bit non-conformist to the actual existing culture, who think in a different style, who have a different education background. I mean, so potentially when the majority comes from a different educational background, these people tend to quickly, evaporate. The other thing is values. And, again, that should be the compass of any organization there. And how much the leaders will live those values is very important, and can be a deterring factor for many leaders who are very qualified, who actually will end up leaving or moving on from an organization when they feel that, they have to be someone that they are not. They have to align with values that don't align with theirs. And these are all honestly red flags that many organizations will see come up in their organizational health survey every year, or in a great place to work survey. There's so many ways to detect this, even in feedbacks for the managers. You kind of can detect these things along the way. And I think, the organizations who do it right are those who actually address those red flags early on. But for me, it's systemic, it's culture, it's, unconscious bias is a great one as part of the culture bit, but also, how we develop our leaders, and how ready are our leaders before they get to a place of leading. And, if they are really ready, they'll be able to also accept that diversity coming from outside or growing from the inside. But, for example, I mean, in one part of my career, I did find myself, for example, transitioning from a manager to a leader and sitting in a senior management team. And to be honest, I mean, I was definitely competent and qualified technically on all levels, but I wasn't ready. I wasn't ready to be a leader. I didn't even know at the time what it meant to lead, or to have a team and all of that. And it was, that you have a number of things that run into your mind. The stress of performing and showing that you're up to the role, and especially as women, we deal a lot with like, am I good enough, and the self-doubt. Yeah. So again, this is one part of it. But then the other part of it is also, have I really been trained to lead other people, And that's why I think this transition is one that should not be discounted. The values and how much importance is placed on that, to really live them, to really integrate them into every single decision. As we said with, for example, other things, when we want to put something into the DNA, we got to ask the questions. Are we living our values? Are we sticking to that? And when we find, leaders who come with different styles, thoughts, whatever it is, a certain, approach that is different than what we know and what we're used to in that, organization, I think we need to be a little bit more tolerant, and we need to continuously check our own biases, because we all have them. And, I've caught myself a number of times, making these assumptions about people, about names, about places, it's just subconscious. And the more we work on that, changing cultures, building inclusive cultures, ensuring that leaders that we put in leadership positions are inclusive, I think we'll see a little bit, more inclusive workplaces, more acceptance for differences. And, honestly, this is my hope. But I think it's as I mentioned, the most challenging part of really driving diversity and inclusion and gender equality in the workplace, for example. But it's doable, and hopefully we get there.
And I'm going to end on that note, because I think that's a very appropriate place to end. So you have given us your full insight about inclusion, about your particular journey of how you have developed and always have been a leader, but actually applied your purpose and intent in your life in a humanitarian way, in an entrepreneurial fashion, as well as bringing in your corporate knowledge to make a big difference in the world. So I am going to ask you if I can check back in with you for your next journey after Arabic, as actually you've moved away from that, and what your next chapter is. So I'd like to check in with you, if I may indulge. And then so we can continue with this conversation on making the world a better place and integrating those frameworks that are established and by the SDGs, and even more depth of application that is going to happen through your work and the work of others. So thank you, Noha. I appreciate you.
Thank you so much for hosting me tonight. It was such a pleasure to be here with you.
Oh, it's been an honor just to have a great conversation. It was open-ended, and I really appreciate that. So thank you for being on Ocular Podcast. We will check back in with you, having different points of view on relevant topics in business and tech. Thank you, Noha.